Hello. In this clip from our Justia webinar, Podcasting 101, Advising Clients in Pre-Production, Production, and Distribution, Alexia Bidet will talk about the podcasting industry, its rise, and the role of the legal industry. Remember, if you want to see more Justia videos on law practice and legal marketing, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thanks, Nina, for the lovely intro. Typically, and as you all know, we're all lawyers here. I don't have to say this. This is all for educational purposes, but I really put it here because especially in the podcast industry, and I'll turn to slides about that, depending on who you're representing, you're going to take a different view on, obviously the different deal points here. And this is going to be while the topic is advising clients in the podcast industry, we're going to look mostly, I'd say, from a transactional point of view, the deals that you'll encounter when you're working with podcast clients. So truly, depending on, which side you're on of the negotiation, it's really going to be very different. So it's, I think, an important disclosure here. I won't say much about myself because Nina did a very kind intro, but here are my details on the screen. Feel free to be in touch if you have any questions after. So this is it's a topic that I personally, as Nina mentioned, I love. I work with a lot of podcast production companies. I think it's a very fun area for lawyers to practice in. And I do mean fun because unlike a lot of entertainment, film, TV, where there's very set precedents, very, custom and practice over decades and decades and decades, relative to that, podcast is a much newer industry, and therefore you have, I would say, more leeway as an attorney to be creative, to come up with different business models, to think about different business models. And also, it's an industry where the host is so central to the success of the medium that I don't think you get away with unfair deals as much as you maybe do in other industries. I don't mean you as in the attorney, but just the industry doesn't. And so you really have to be creative to get to a deal that everybody at the very least feels somewhat on board with. So we'll do, there'll be an overview of all that kind of work and what you may be brought to do as an attorney advising in this space. And like I said, we'll focus especially on the deal-making process and a little bit as well on clearances. So the objectives are there on the screen, and I think you're, familiar with them if you've signed up or if you're watching this. But we'll, look at the legal processes with creating and distributing podcasts. We'll look at the different types of agreements and identify some potential issues that are maybe a bit more specific to podcasting than if you were negotiating just another different type of content. In terms of the agenda, we'll go through a little bit at a macro level, sort of podcasts, how they come to life, a little bit on that, the different rights elements in a podcast. And then we'll go through the different kinds of agreements you might encounter. We'll then dig deeper a little bit on a bit of contract specific clauses. And then briefly on clearance issues, what you may be advised to do if you're also the clearance counsel on a project. And then we'll do a bit of, if there are Q&As, we'll wrap up. And that'll be that. All right, well, let's get going. So the life of a podcast, how do they start? And this is relevant here because depending on how the show starts, your role as the attorney is probably going to be different, right? So the shows are typically pitched in a number of ways. They may start with the agents that are going, and the agents represent either talent or they represent production companies. In some cases, they may represent the actual network or the platform, and they'll go and pitch shows. So that happens sometimes, and you may be asked at that level, maybe not the pitch, but as soon as there's interest, to step in a more business affairs capacity and to help advise your client, to work in tandem really with the agents on advising on the deal terms. So if you're doing that, having a really, an understanding of the industry, and it's a very fast moving industry, and there's a lot of great trade publications that you can follow. But if you're sort of getting involved early at that business affairs level, that's very helpful. Sometimes you just have individuals who are going to be pitching to different buyers, financiers, and you might be helping that individual if they don't really have an agent, not necessarily as an agent, but, supporting again, business affairs level. And sometimes the production companies are pitching to the buyers, and sometimes it's production companies are pitching to other production companies to split the costs of the production if they don't have a buyer yet. And that's where you may be brought to draft a co-production agreement where you're, probably representing one side or the other. So just slide is really just that, depending on what stage, you get involved, your role is going to be different. And a little bit briefly on how these, shows are monetized, and that's going to be important in terms of how the deal is structured. But there's, typically either if it's a production company and there's a buyer, whether it's Spotify, Audible, Wondery, fill in the blank, those places are typically often either they're funding the budget, which is where you see there at the top, or maybe if you look at the fourth bullet point, they're not funding it, but they're getting exclusive distribution rights, and they are giving you they're giving your client a minimum guarantee against those exclusive distribution rights. In some cases, like I said, it's going to be co-productions. It might be a branded podcast where a brand hires your client or you represent the brand to have a podcast that is giving information about the podcast. And typically there, it's going to be a work for hire. The production company is going to have their production expenses and costs covered, as well as typically charge a production fee, which is where they'll make their profit. And that'll be a line item in the budget. And there's all kinds of considerations there about what happens if your client's deal gets terminated. Do they get to retain their production fee? Sort of thinking through, because often in those positions, if you're just doing a work for hire and your client is doing it on a work for hire basis, the commissioning entity can, decide to stop at any point. So your role as the attorney there, it's important to think through, well, if they stop, and it happens unfortunately often. So if they pull the plug on this project, is the client protected? Do they retain their production fee? Do they retain it in full? Do they retain it prorated to the amount of weeks that they've been working or months? Do they get some, other fees? Are they recouping all of their expenses? So sort of thinking through what happens when it goes wrong, depending on how the show's monetized, is particularly important. There's a few other things. I mean, there's first look deals, which you may have seen in the news a lot, where there's one entity, typically a film or TV production, that gets a first look. They will be the first person that gets to turn the podcast into film TV. And often the money that they pay in exchange for the first look is what allows your client, the podcast production company, to develop new shows. And there's different ways to structure it. This slide is just briefly here in terms of, if you think of the topic of this CLE, which is advising clients in the podcast industry, there's often this notion and this thought of derivatives, and derivative rights are hotly negotiated. What happens if it gets turned into a film TV show? If you're representing the production company, if it gets turned into a film TV show, is the production company somehow involved? Whether that's, do they get a share of the revenue from the film TV rights? Do they get an opportunity to be attached as executive producers? If you're representing the talents, the hosts, same question. So the derivatives are always a very important part of negotiation. I think there's maybe a little bit of a misconception that all podcasts turn into film TV, which is, of course, not true, but it's important to think about the what if and to have your contract that plans for that.
Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next clip.